Hello everyone, welcome back to Path to Programming's very first intro programming lesson. Today we're going to talk about how to print and use variables in Python. Printing and variables are some of the most basic programming concepts that every programmer should be pretty familiar with. But before we actually get started with writing our first lines of code, we need to talk about the actual software that we're going to be using. So the software that we're going to be using to write the code is known as Replit. Replit is a free online website that you can use to write code as long as you have an internet connection. So to actually access it, all we have to do is type repl.it and then we'll put it in the Google search and we can just click on the first link. And by the way, all the resources that we use in this video will be in the description. So if you want to use them, go ahead and click on the link in the description. So after you're taken to this landing page, all you want to do is click the big blue button at the bottom that says Start Coding, and it'll take you to a sign-in page. You can create a username and password if you want, but I already have a Google account. If you have a Gmail, then all you have to do is click Continue with Google and select the account that you want to use, and it'll sign you in. So from here, we're on sort of the home page for Replit. All we really care about is this big blue button in the top left that says Create. If we click on that, a little window will pop up that says Create a REPL. All we want to do is in the template search Python, because that's the language that we're going to use. Click on Python and then you can name it whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and name it Intro Lesson just because I like to be specific when I name things. And you can ignore the other stuff, just click Create REPL. So from there, we're taken to this page. This is where we'll actually write our code and actually run it. So there's sort of a lot going on here, but let's break it down. So on the very left, you'll see this Files tab. We won't really have to deal with this much. We'll be writing all of our code pretty much in the same file, but you can see that it's highlighted main.py. So what this means is that all the code that we're writing right now is inside this main.py file. In the center, it also says main.py. That's just, again, the file that we're working in. And the center part is actually the text editor. This is where we're going to type out all our different lines of code, and the computer knows to start reading it there. And then on the very right, this is the console. The console is what just displays the output of our code. So this is really important. Everything that we write in this text editor on the left, the output of it is taken and displayed in the console. So you might notice another word that I sort of threw out in the beginning was run. Running essentially means that the computer knows to start reading the code. The way we do that is just by clicking this big green run button at the top. As soon as we click that, the computer will start reading our code, and it'll start taking the output and putting it into the console. So before we actually get started, I want to talk about programming generally and what coding means before we write our first lines. So coding generally is just giving a computer instructions. We have to tell them exactly what we want and the computer can execute it. It's pretty similar to giving people instructions in real life. Say for instance, if somebody wanted to find the nearest McDonald's, if they were using Google Maps or even if they were talking to a person, it would be similar. The person would have to tell them, okay, take a right in the next mile, and then when you see this specific landmark, the McDonald's will be across the street. It's sort of like that, except with the computer, we have to give them more specific instructions and instructions that are in a specific language that the computer can understand. Python is one of those languages, and that's why we're going to learn our first lines of code that the computer can understand. Another word that I'll start to throw around in these lessons is syntax. I'll go ahead and type that out, even though this doesn't actually mean anything in terms of code. Syntax is essentially just the letters and symbols and numbers that make up all the different commands that we have. So the first thing we're going to learn how to do is print. So I'm going to show you the specific syntax of how to print something in Python. So the words, letters, and symbols that make up the print command in Python is just typing print, parentheses, quotation marks, and then whatever you want to print. So I'm going to go ahead and run this program, and this might happen whenever you run for the first time. It'll just update this console thing, but then after you do that, you'll see hello world. So what this means is after we clicked run, the computer went and started to read the code lines that I wrote, and it saw that we gave it the command to print. After we gave it that command, it looked at what we put inside these quotation marks and just dropped it into the console. That's all it was. So this is a concept that we're going to build on a lot more, and there's a lot more intricacies we have, but let's start getting into that. First, I just want to print some sort of blank statements. You can, just to show you that whatever you put inside these quotation marks, the computer will just print out. So for example, I can say my friend is John, and then I can print John is 36, and then I can print I like John, but my friends don't. So just sort of some blanket statements that don't really mean anything. If I run this program, you'll see it's the same sort of deal. The computer knows to take exactly what I put inside these quotation marks and just put it into the console on each line. And so this is actually going to help us introduce sort of our next concept, which is variables. So with variables, you can essentially just think of them as a container that stores information. It's a little bit different from math. In math, we're told variables are just letters that store numbers, and we need those for like equations later on. But in programming, it's different. We have just sort of a value, and we can assign that value anything we want. So you might notice for these lines that I'm printing out, they're a little bit repetitive. In every line, I say John, but let's say I could create a variable name called John. So I could create a variable called name and assign the value of John. So in this scenario, nothing is really different. I just created this box that's called name, and I put the value John inside that box. So now actually what we can do is just add on to this, and we can close that phrase. And the way you tell the computer you want to use a variable in a print statement is just putting a comma and then the name of the variable. So now when the computer goes onto this line, all it's going to do is print this phrase, my friend is, and then it's going to see the comma, and it's first of all, it's going to close that statement, then it's going to see the comma, and it's going to look at name, and it's going to be like, what is name? So it's going to go to the top and see that name is equal to John, and then all we have to do is substitute the value John for that variable. So we can go ahead and do this on our other lines too. Just make sure you need a comma separating a variable in every other statement that you have. So in this scenario, the variable is separate from both of these statements. You need a comma and then another comma. So in this scenario, after we run it, it should say the exact same thing as what it says right now. And like that, you can see that it works. So on every single line, the program sees the print command, and then it knows to take what's in the quotation marks and drop it into the console, and then it sees the name variable. So it goes up and checks the value of name and then substitutes that on that line. You might be thinking, what's sort of the practical use of having these variables? But let's say in like a real world scenario, I'm trying to collect information on people, and I had to collect their name, their age, whether or not their friends like them, and that sort of information. But I potentially got the client's name wrong. And let's say in this scenario, their name wasn't John, their name was actually Josh. I don't want to have to go through every single line and change their name from John to Josh. Instead, since I made it a variable, all I have to do is go up to line 1 and make it Josh instead of John. And then if I run that program, now you can see on every line when I print it out, the name says Josh instead of John. So variables have a lot more uses than that, but that's just sort of like the basics of what we can do with them. So now let's think about the rules for variables. In programming, there's sort of a couple generally accepted rules that we have to follow. So the first rule is that we can't have multiple words as a variable name. So if I wanted to create a variable that's called name of client, I can't have it as separate words. So I can't say name of client. It wouldn't work. If I run this program, we should get some sort of error. As you can see, the error that we get is a syntax error, invalid syntax. Like I was saying, syntax is just the letters and symbols and numbers, all the different characters that make up the commands for programming. So what this is telling us is that name of client doesn't mean anything in terms of syntax. That's not actually a Python code word. So what the convention is in Python, what all Python programmers will do, if they want to create a variable with multiple words, they just put underscores in between them. So I could say name of client and set it equal to Josh, and then our program runs fine. So that's sort of the first rule when it comes to variables. The second rule is, this isn't really a technical rule. It doesn't harm your code at all, but typically programmers don't create variables that start with capital letters. So if I wanted to create a variable called last name, I could create it like this. I could create a variable called last name like that and start it with a capital letter. And if I wanted to add another one, I wanted to add it here, I could just do it like that. And if I run the program, it should work. It'll say my friend is Josh Smith. But it's just generally accepted that you don't really start your programming variables with a capital letter. So from there, there's really only one more thing about variables that we care about, and that's this equal sign. We'll learn more about this in our next video when we talk about conditional statements, which is like if this then that. But the general idea is that this equal sign only works one way. In programming, or in math, sorry, we're taught that the equal sign makes everything on both sides equal. The left side is equal to the right side and the right side is equal to the left side. In programming, it's different. When you have one equal sign like this, all it means is that we're assigning a value. So we're taking this box of name, like I was saying, and we're putting the value of Josh in that box. We're assigning Josh to name. On line 2, we're assigning Josh to name of client. We're taking a box of name of client and we're putting the value of Josh inside that. And on line 3, it's the same thing. We assign the value of Smith to last name. It doesn't work the same way, unfortunately. So we can't say Smith is being assigned the value of last name. It's always the left is being assigned the right. So that's sort of the basics of just variables. But there's one last thing I sort of want to talk about. This question you might have already thought of, but it's just sort of what can we store inside these variables? And this is the last thing we'll cover in this video. In the next one, we'll talk about conditional statements. But we've already seen a couple of the things that we can store in variables. So we've seen something called strings. Strings are basically just everything that is inside these quotation marks. So I'll go ahead and write these out. So the first thing is strings. Strings are the words, letters, numbers, even symbols that we want to store. And it's basically anything in quotation marks. So Smith is a string, Josh is a string, my friend is a string, is 36 is a string, and then I like and but my friends don't. Those are all strings. So we've seen those already. And we can store strings in variables like we see on line 1, 2, and 3. Those are all strings in variables. The next thing we can store in variables are numbers. So we were talking about this earlier, but I could potentially store numbers inside the string. I could say Smith 990. And if I want to do the same thing again and put last name here, it'll print it exactly like that. My friend is Josh Smith 990. But programming, actually, like the programming code itself, can understand those numbers. So we don't have to put it inside a string. So if I want to create a variable called age and assign it the value of 36, I can do that. And let's say on line 8, I want to change this to print the age variable. So now we get the exact same output. On the second line in the console, we see that it says Josh is 36. And on that line, the computer sees the print command. It checks the value of name, and name is Josh. It prints is, just because, like we said, it's a string. And then it checks the value of age, and age is 36. So same thing, if I want to change the value of age to 1000, if I run that program, it's the exact same thing. Now Josh is 1000 years old. So that's the second thing that we can store in variables. So far we've looked at strings and numbers. The last sort of big thing that we can store in these variables are something called Booleans. And I'll go ahead and write that out. That's spelled Boolean, B-O-O-L-E-A-N. So Booleans are just a value that's either true or false. And the value of these are really more important for the conditional statements. So we'll talk about that more later. But essentially, you could create any variable. So for example, you could create a variable called is tired. And you can assign it the value of true. And then basically, that's your Boolean value. It's either true, it's either true or false. And they always have to start with a capital F or capital T so that the program knows you're trying to create a Boolean value. And again, we'll use these more in our future videos, but those are the basic types that we're going to store in variables. And what these are known as are data types. They're basically exactly what it sounds like. They're the type of data that we can store in our variables. But that's pretty much everything I have for you today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Our information is going to be in the description. You can leave a comment below, or you can go to our Facebook page as well. The link will be at the end of the video and in the description. But yeah, that's variables and printing.